welcome to today's CircleCI webinar. We're going to get started in just a few moments once the attendees level off. But in the meantime, just some quick housekeeping. Please use the Zoom Q&A chat box for any questions that you may have throughout the session. And there will be time set aside at the end for Q&A. So we'll get started shortly, and thank you for your attendance. Alrighty. Seems like we have a couple people filtering in. I'm going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover today. Let's get going. So my name is Mo Alanyan, and I've been a solutions engineer here at CircleCI for about 2 years now. I'm based out of Washington, D.C., and fun fact about me is I used to write code for autonomous boats for the Navy. Less fun fact, though, we didn't have a CI/CD pipeline. And that's why I'm excited to talk to you all today, because I know what it looks like to not have your DevOps in order and how much of a difference it can really make to invest in your CI/CD, not just for your business today, but as you scale your business for tomorrow. So today, I'm excited about showing you all of the fundamentals of CircleCI, as well as a demonstration of the product. Note that this is a webinar, so while there isn't any two-way communication available, we do have a Q&A chat box available for you to use. If you have any questions along the way, please drop them into the chat box. If I can answer them during the demo, I will do my best, but no worries, I will make sure to answer any outstanding questions at the end of the call. All right, enough about me. Let's talk about you. Or more specifically, let's talk about how this conversation today is going to benefit you. Firstly, we're going to talk about who this session is aimed at and why they should be interested in what we're going to cover today. We're then going to talk about the architecture of CircleCI and in particular, how we build pipelines. Finally, once we're aligned on terminology, we'll jump into a product demo. The overall theme here is that we're going to focus on the journey from the perspective of a developer. Since developers are who use CircleCI day to day, we want to approach this through the eyes, ears, and experience of the average developer. So let's start with who is this for. Really, it's for anyone that's involved in the software delivery challenges. If you're a developer focused on agility and want to be empowered to move quickly without the fear of breaking things, this conversation is for you. If you're in security and governance, if you work in the CISO's office, or if you work with attestation or internal auditors, this conversation today is for you, right? Because you're focused on risk mitigation and management. You want the organization to move safely with high-level awareness and transparency. And we're absolutely going to talk about that. If you're a leader across engineering or specializing in platform engineering or developer experience, AKA your concern is making sure that you can scale while maintaining productivity, managing efficiencies, reducing costs, etc., across a broad system and set of teams and departments, this conversation is for you. And why is it for these folks? Because we're going to talk about CircleCI overall. We're going to talk about what it is, how it works, kind of the nuts and bolts. But then we're also going to talk about these areas of developer happiness, right? Developer happiness is important, not just because it's nice to have happy developers, which is, but developer happiness is also important because when developers are enabled and feel empowered, they're more productive, right? You get high quality output from professionals when they feel that empowerment and a purpose and a sense to achieve it. So in the next couple of segments, we're going to touch on how this works and get into the nuts and bolts of CircleCI. We're also going to continue to talk about how developer happiness and security, and then we're going to finish on the visibility and how we analyze and track what we're doing. So let's get started. Before we jump into our developer story today, though, I want to quickly take you through the architecture of CircleCI, particularly how it looks at the top level. In other words, the concepts that we need to know to understand how CircleCI works. So we'll start here with the configuration hierarchy. So pretty much, I'm going to go into it in the demo, but CircleCI believes deeply in the paradigm of configuration as code. And that means the only way to configure a software delivery pipeline in CircleCI is through a configuration file checked into a software repository. Now, at the highest level, every configuration file is considered a pipeline, which is essentially a set of workflows that share relevant parameters. A workflow is a combination of jobs ordered into a particular sequence. A job is a collection of steps to achieve a particular outcome. This is the level at which we spin up a clean container for you, and everything inside that job is going to be run inside the same container, having access to the same files, etc. But when it's done, it'll be cleaned and only lasts for the span of that job and then destroyed afterwards. And finally, a step is a executable, pretty much any executable command. So going back up that chain, a step is pretty much one part of a job that you want to get done. Let's say the job is running a security scan. A step is downloading a scanning tool like Sneak. Multiple steps can be in a job, and it's useful because you can break down any job into a series of steps required to get it done. A step up. Jobs are everything that is done to achieve a particular outcome. Like the example before, a job can be a security scan. So within that job, it'll spin up, for example, a Docker small environment. Download a tool, enter the right directory, run the scan, and then upload those artifacts somewhere. All of those steps happen within a deterministic one-time use execution environment that gets wiped after each run. So that's the job. Now, another step, multiple jobs define a workflow, and that workflow is in charge of the sequence of those jobs. Some jobs can run in sequence while others run in parallel, and that's all based on the needs of your team. Multiple workflows that can be run based on things like triggers, parameters, timing, etc., are pipelines, which are our highest unit of work here at CircleCI. So I hope that all makes sense, because this is kind of like the foundation of CircleCI. So it's really great to talk about empowering developers to do all of this stuff within a configuration file that can be checked into a repository. As soon as they check it into a repository, CircleCI is going to take it and run. Now, while all of this is really great for empowerment, it can certainly raise some eyebrows when you talk about the access that these teams have. So on top of our configuration files, we layer what are called config policies. Config policies are the lock that security and central app admin teams can layer on top of the use of configuration files. It's org-wide, it's administratively controlled, and it is an automated engine that defines what is allowed, reserved, or restricted from developer behavior. Anything in that configuration file can be inspected along with some key metadata, for example, like what branch we're on. And you can go ahead and restrict certain things based on that. As I mentioned before, every job can run in its own execution environment, and there are a lot of options to choose from here, giving you flexibility while still having those guardrails attached. You can choose from Windows, Mac, Linux, Docker, and have a workflow with any combination of these resource classes shown on the right. Additionally, if you need to use your own specialized compute or have any restrictive security requirements, we also give you the option to use self-hosted runners. They can either be Kubernetes-based container runners or machine-based runners for installs on specialized compute. Depending on what you're looking for, the compute that you need can be tailored to your specific task. We give you full access to the numerous resource classes that we have available, which are shown here. And that, especially in terms of Docker, goes from anything from 1 vCPU and 2 gigs of RAM, all the way up to 20 vCPUs and 40 gigs of RAM included. We also have GPU resource classes as well, if you have specific needs that require GPUs. And naturally, of course, the cost is dependent on the resource class and size that is used here. We also have a large amount of package integrations at CircleCI, and we refer to them as Orbs. So where you're doing common things like pushing assets to Artifactory or integrating with AWS to deploy assets to production, or maybe you're deploying an ML model to SageMaker or building a particular Node, Maven, or Gradle application, anything like that. We have Orbs for all of those, either built internally by CircleCI, amazing partners that we have out in the ecosystem, or a great third-party community. And all of these really simplify what it takes to accomplish any particular integration with CircleCI. All of them are listed in our Orb registry shown on our website, and I'll go through and show you that a little bit later as well. Next, and very new, I want to talk about releases. It's an open preview currently, and it adds that end-to-end visibility our customers have been asking for so long, right? Like, what happens after I deploy? I push something out to AWS at the end of my pipeline, and then what, right? Is it healthy? Is it running? Is it scaling? Is it as performant as the previous version? If it's failing, how do I prevent catastrophe, right? Up until recently, you needed another tool to monitor all of that. But that didn't sit right with our methodology of DevOps as a single tool of observability. So now, this is exactly what CircleCI releases do. You can monitor your integrations post-deployment and with Kubernetes currently. So if you have a cluster out there and you have our agent installed, it's monitoring for any components that come into that cluster and what version they're on. If those components are using things like Argo rollouts, it will actually monitor the scenarios and the steps that you have and report on whether that rollout succeeded or not for Canary type deployments. And you can also do things like Helm and Argo commands to scale or restore deployments, as well as restart any pods as needed. So it's an incredibly useful observability tool that can also help monitor your releases after they're done with your CI/CD pipeline. All right, now let's jump in and see what this looks like inside of CircleCI. So I'm going to hop over here, and this is just a glance at the CircleCI dashboard. This provides a single pane of glass for all of our high-level users, such as admins and operators, to see what's going on within the organization. These pipelines here on the left are information-rich. If you remember, pipelines are the highest unit of work here on CircleCI, and we can filter them, you can see here, by individual pipelines, projects. You can select branches, days, and also status, right? So we have pretty complex filters here for you as well. Now, I'm going to hop into one of these pipelines here. We'll do this one. And we'll go into a workflow. This one's good. All right, so now if we go down a step deeper, we have our workflows, which is this particular view here. You can see that it is a graph of jobs which dictates the order in which jobs are executed and maps out their interdependencies. Jobs can be run sequentially, you can see across here, or in parallel. And this is powerful because it gives you the ability to really coordinate complex jobs and optimize them for speed and efficiency. This is my favorite view personally because it's really easily lays out the steps in your pipeline. You can see with the set of concurrent jobs on the left, right here, for example, of the scale that can be achieved here. So for a big team that needs to run thousands of concurrent jobs and workflows at the same time, CircleCI provides the ability to scale and meet this use case. So if you remember, jobs are the next lowest level of work here and are basically a series of steps that are run inside an execution environment. Jobs are great because it allows you to break your build process into steps. And as a result, it gives you the control to fail your build if any of those particular steps fail, which saves you time and gets quick feedback into the hands of your engineers. So you can see that I have entered this particular job here. We can see, like I showed earlier, that we're using this Docker extra large container, right? Now, this job is executed, you can see from this particular branch that we specified in the configuration, and down here are all our individual steps. If you remember, steps are the lowest level of work here. And as you can see, each step, if I click on it, has a visible audit log, right? So you can see exactly what's going on inside of the terminal and straight from the terminal, right? So you can see that. You can see pretty much exactly what's going on for each step. Yeah, just like that. All of the containers and environments that we use at CircleCI are ephemeral and deterministic. So essentially, they're for one-time use only and get destroyed after each use. And most importantly, you can scale them horizontally or vertically as much as you need. So these are the key building blocks of CircleCI that we need to understand before we can dive a little bit deeper. So we've spoken about pipelines, workflows, jobs, and steps. We've also talked about releases and pretty much gone over the entire hierarchy. We've seen what they look like in our dashboard and how we can use them to retrieve relevant and valuable information about our builds. So with concepts out of the way, let's jump into the actual demo. So we're going to walk through the scenario here of path to production. That's the conversation. I want to get my code out into production as quickly as possible. The reason for that is production is where end value occurs, right? But before we do that, I want to take a moment to talk you through a real-life use case that is regularly solved using CircleCI. Let's say we have a developer whose code is hosted on their github.com repository, right? In this case, when we trigger a workflow or pipeline in CircleCI, you can see we have a linting job, a testing job, a build job for some Docker images, and they get stored in our Nexus registry over here. And then we'll deploy that application to either a development or production cluster hosted on AWS, EKS, right? In order for these jobs to be successful, we also need to pull credentials from a Vault instance, which is stored in AWS. We also have some of our jobs running on our own self-hosted runners down here, all right? Now, it's worth noting that we've made opinionated choices here to use things like GitHub Enterprise, AWS, Nexus, but these could easily be substituted for things like GitLab, GCP, Artifactory, etc. But this is the use case that we're going to refer back to today when we're talking about what our developer is working on, right? So we talked about how getting to production is where value occurs. I don't think a lot of people would argue with that. It's important to get to production. We want to do it safely, but we also want to do it really quickly. In order to do so, your deployments and releases must be low risk, frequent, rapid, cost-effective, and predictable. And so one of the goals that we talk about is getting a commit to production in a single day, right? Whether it's a hot fix, an experiment, a patch, whatever the concern might be. How long is it going to take you to get that into your production environment? Most ideally, the answer is a day. But what if we wanted to let new developers commit in a day? What if it's their first day, at the job? How can we allow that to happen safely without the new guy or gal bringing down production? Now, I can't see you all, but I just felt all the engineering managers cringe at the thought. How could we let that happen? They don't know the policies. The risk of letting that happen would be absurd. But when you balance empowerment and control, ¿por qué no los dos, right? Why not do both? Empowerment and control. And that's exactly what CircleCI is going to accomplish for you. We basically let you do this through balancing that speed and efficiency that developers want. Essentially, how can they get through this as quickly as possible alongside, right, the important part, the governance that you need to scale, right? Any engineering leader today needs to be equally concerned with both sides of the equation. You need to make sure that there aren't any bottlenecks in the process for the developers to make their critical deliveries and keep value flowing for the business, while simultaneously making sure that critical safety policies are being adhered to by every single person in the organization. It is your duty to protect the organization and the individuals of that organization. So given all of that, this is how we're going to roll through the demo today. Speed, efficiency, guardrails. And we're going to dive into some specific areas of each. So let's begin. Pillar 1, speed, right? So we're going to now actually talk about where the developer does their work, the IDE. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my VS Code onto the screen here. So yeah, this is the very popular IDE VS Code, and our developer is here during their day-to-day. Now, we want to talk a little bit about reducing context switching in order to optimize speed and efficiency. So, in order to reduce that context switching, we want the developer to have all of the information available at their fingertips where they are most familiar and comfortable. So we're going to talk a little bit about the CircleCI VS Code extension. But first, actually, while I have the configuration up, I'm going to kind of go through that really quickly and just show you the elements there as well. So, let's say my developer has been working on this configuration file for this pipeline. And let's just take a look at the configuration as code from a developer's perspective and how we can use our configuration files to aid us in creating better and reusable pipelines, right? If before I pull this up, let me kind of refresh your memory a little bit to a few slides ago where we spoke about the structure, right, of the configuration file, the pipelines, workflows, jobs, and steps. So we're gonna take this from the top, right? Remember, this configuration file is going to represent a pipeline. And you can see up at the top, the very first section is actually those orbs, those reusable configurations that I was talking about. I'll show you an example of that a little bit later. But next on the configuration is our executors, our execution environments declared. In this case, they're all Docker images, with one of them here having a specific extra large resource class. So it's a little beefier, right? After that, we have our jobs, right? And these are how jobs are defined. You can see that it's YAML based, so really easy to read. Each one of these is a job, right? And you can see that we define the job. We then say, hey, we want you to use this execution environment, the one that we just defined up here, right? And then we come down to the steps, right? Remember the steps being the lowest unit of work, each one being an executionable action. So you can see that each step here, right? We're doing a checkout, we're running a pip, we're doing a lint, right? For this particular job. And then the next one is defined here, and so on and so forth. So these are all of the jobs, and you can get real, granular with it. We're pretty much giving you access to, a actual runtime machine environment under this. So you can run commands the way you would if the computer was right in front of you. And then last, we have our workflows, right? Now, if you remember, the workflows are the dependency matrix of the jobs that we've created. So you can see that the way we list them is we list the jobs in the order, well, not even particularly the order we want them to run in, but we can define things like dependencies, right? So we have this particular Java check style job, has no dependencies, right? And CircleCI by default is going to try to run things in parallel to optimize for speed. So the nice thing is you don't even have to tell it to do that. Instead, if something does have a requirement, we can go down to this requires tag right here. So you can see that for this deploy job, right, which makes sense, we want to deploy after we build and test. So you can see that the requires will require that to happen first before we can go ahead and deploy to dev or production, right? Other tags that we have are filters. So you can see that, hey, we only want this to run on a particular branch for this one only main. And we also have contexts, right? Which are credentials. So for instance, and I'll talk a little bit more about these later, but we can say, hey, this particular job here requires these contexts, which are lists of secrets, credentials, environment variables, that type of stuff. So they're not actually displayed in the configuration here, but they can be accessed through CircleCI with the correct permissions set by guardrails. And then at the bottom, we have commands. Commands are just reusable commands. They can be named and they can be reused again and again to further reduce technical debt and to standardize a particular piece of logic, which overall increases speed and reduces room for error as well. So kind of what did we see here? We saw an easy to configure, easy to read configuration file, which ultimately builds our pipelines. It even has built-in linting. And ultimately, this allows our developers to quickly onboard onto CircleCI, quickly acclimate to reusable commands, especially in the form of orbs, and very quickly get building good quality software. So let's hop back. Let me talk about that VS Code plugin. So you can see here, right here, that's the CircleCI plugin. You can see kind of on the left, you can actually see my pipeline view, very similar to what you could see in the UI, right? And so what the plugin does is it analyzes all the CircleCI workflows, and every time a commit is made, we can actually see those workflows kick off and executing in real time in this panel on the left. So I'm going to hop into a particular example here. You can see that this particular workflow, it says it failed, right? And so, we can be like, oh, why did it fail? Click into it and it goes, oh, look at that, your end-to-end tests, right? There's a failure in there. Without going into the UI on the web, I'm still staying in my IDE here, where I'm doing all of my work. I can click into this, right? And all of a sudden I get a whole bunch of information about what happened, right? You can see that all of my tests failed, right? So whatever I did was not working. And you can see, if I hop here, you can see, hey, exactly what the output was for these Cypress tests that failed, right? So, the best part about this is, again, we don't have to leave my IDE. I don't have to go into the UI. I can stay in the IDE, right? On top of that, let's say I need to do some debugging, right? I can open the configuration file that was compiled, right? Or I can rerun, the particular job straight from here. And another great and probably my favorite tool is rerun with SSH, right? Because this is plugged in straight into VS Code, we can actually rerun that job. And what it'll do is it'll open up a SSH window into the exact machine that is running your build, right? So that you can poke around in there, you can play around with the files, you can see what's happening at a system level, not just trying to debug stuff that is getting spit out in the UI. So it really gives you a hands-on debugging approach, again, without leaving your IDE. So this is definitely one of my favorite features. And as a result, I've minimized context switching. And all of the information that I need from CircleCI is right here at my fingertips. And most importantly, as a developer, I can stay where I am comfortable and most productive. So in fact, if you can tell, a lot of developers won't even need to come into the UI dashboard because all of the work that they need to be done can be done directly from here inside the IDE. So we're going to hop back to the dashboard and kind of do a little bit of a comparison here. And there's actually, if you notice here, there's an open in browser button that you can click as well. That'll just take you exactly to that same test in the browser. But I have it over here. This is that same end-to-end test, right, that failed. You can see that in the UI, it looks pretty much exactly the same, okay? Those Cypress tests failed. You can even hop into the testing tab here, and it'll give you all of the tests that failed and what the output was. So you can do some debugging that way as well. And then of course, like I said, you have the option to rerun, right? So the cool part is you have the option to rerun from the beginning. You can rerun from where it failed. You can rerun the particular test that failed, right? Let's say it's a flaky test that is a flaky test, sometimes based on network or time of day. It sometimes fails. You can just run it again just to check. And of course, you can, like I said, you can rerun that job with SSH. In this case, if you do that in the UI, it won't just open up as easily as it did in VS Code. It'll just give you the username and key to go ahead and access that from your own SSH window. So still super convenient. And I love that it makes it so easy to debug whatever's going wrong with your particular pipelines. So yeah. So what's the impact of what we just saw here? We've reduced the mean time to recovery for when issues do arise. We've also significantly reduced dependency on other teams in our organizations, such as support and central ops teams. Additionally, we have reduced the need for developers to constantly context switch. And as such, we have increased our developers' efficiency, allowing them to ship code quicker, right? Speed. And the quicker that you can ship code, the easier it is to stay ahead of your competition. So for this next section, keep in mind that engineering teams themselves want to focus on revenue generating technology, not the pain points that come with CI/CD. Developers want to spend their time hitting delivery targets and not waiting on feedback from their CI/CD tool. And that is why speed is so important to the velocity that you deliver value to your customers, right? We want feedback information faster, but in order for that information to be available faster, the pipelines and workflows themselves need to execute faster. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take a look at some of the things that we can implement so that developers can get feedback on changes as soon as possible. So I'm going to hop back into the UI and I'm going to look at this particular successful build, right? So in this particular job step here, you can see what we're doing is we are taking what is a fairly beefy Docker image, and within about 40 seconds, right, we are building and pushing that image to our Nexus container, right? 40 seconds is pretty quick for the size of Docker container that it is. How is it going so fast? What we're doing is we're using a really powerful feature called Docker layer caching, which allows us to significantly speed up this building and pushing process for our Docker build. And in this job as well, you can see that we have steps that restore the cache beforehand and go ahead and save that cache afterwards, right? And depending on the type of data or the type of functionality you need, be it workspaces, caches, artifacts, all of that cache is going to stay there pretty much. They'll persist over time to maximize speed and efficiency. So, data can be persisted really quickly and easily. That's typically useful as well to allow us to cache things like libraries and dependencies, so we can quickly access them later and ultimately speed up our pipelines. And we can see that our developers have also used that feature quite effectively here. The next one, right, we're going to talk about is parallelism, right? We spoke recently about what the things that CircleCI does to optimize the speed of your workflows. But let's say what happens when we have large test cases that are very cumbersome and can slow down our pipeline significantly, right? Sometimes you just have a real large test suite and it's the bottleneck in your pipeline, and all of a sudden you're waiting 30 minutes for these tests to run. What we have is a really cool feature called parallelism, which allows us to replicate our testing environment as many times as is necessary to get the job done quickly and efficiently, right? So what that does essentially is it'll spin up an exactly identical environment to this, right? So you can see these are the two parallel runs here, exactly the same Docker small, but what we can do on top of that is impose what's called test splitting, right? This is a feature that allows us to equally distribute our test cases based on a provided parameter, such as the file name, or if you want to get real technical with it, how long they take to run. So for this particular, right, you can see we're running 36 tests. And you can see, right, that we have split those tests up into two exactly the same execution environments, right? But the only difference that's going to be running is half of the test will run in one, half of the test will run in the other. And it may even be a 60-30 split. What CircleCI can do is take the timings of those tests and optimize them so that both of these parallel runs finish at around the same time. So if these were all running in sequence, right, this would take a little over a minute to run. Now that they're running in parallel, we've brought it down to about 37 seconds. And obviously, the more tests you have, the better that this scales and the more efficient it's going to be with your time. So I hope that makes sense. Now, let's talk about what happens when tests fail. So let me go to an example of a failed test here. We give you a couple options to really speed up your debugging process. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, you have all of these options for when you want to rerun those tests. And on top of that, we give you a little bit of insight on your tests. So this one isn't flaky, but if it was particularly flaky, CircleCI would have a little notification here saying, hey, this test sometimes passes and sometimes fails. This is flaky. You should probably take a look at it, right? So the cool part about this is you get that feedback instantly. So whether it be here, and you can see even if I go up to the workflow, you know exactly what part of it failed. If I go back to the pipeline, it'll show you, hey, this workflow failed. And the best part about that is it's really easy to see what's going wrong, get feedback into the hands of your developers, and then hopefully fix that problem and keep on going. So Yeah, that is pretty much in terms of CircleCI, what we do for testing, whether they pass or fail, and the different options that you have. So in conclusion, developers don't want to sit around and wait for feedback. As a result, CircleCI provides a suite of options and features to reduce context switching, reduce your workflow duration, and ultimately move your organization in the direction of building faster. Next is efficiency, right? I want to move away from the story of the developer for a moment, and I want to talk a little bit about our administrators and our operators of CircleCI. In other words, the folks who are responsible in our organization for ensuring that cost is under control. We want to ensure that they have the visibility that they need for reporting in order to track performance of our pipelines and deployments over time. With this, we can use the Insights dashboard. So we can take a look at that now. So if I come to my Insights tab on the CircleCI dashboard, we can see all of the workflow ones that are a part of our pipeline. So you can kind of see here, this is the, actually, let's go to the overview here. Here we go. These are the recent workflow runs. You can see the workflow success rate. You can see the average workflow duration and how much it's costing you, right? The workflow credit usage. And so we give you a couple different filtering options as well as timing options so you can really see trends over time. If I want to dive into this a little bit further, I can actually go into the jobs tab here, and I can actually analyze and assess the CPU and RAM usage of particular jobs, right? So this is particularly useful for relevant teams to predict, plan, and ensure the use of appropriate features and resource classes, right? So you can see that this particular job, not even using 32% of CPU and not 1% of RAM, right? And you can go into really any particular job and get that feedback, which is really nice to see. And it's printed out right here as well. So it's a pretty good overview. We want to think about efficiency, right? For example, if you have a job that seems to be taking a long time and you check and see, hey, it's actually maxing out the CPU and RAM, you can go ahead and bump up that resource class and, as a result, save time on your builds, right? More power, hopefully will run things a lot faster. But the opposite is also true, right? We can really get efficient with our execution environments and either parallelize work or scale resources back if we notice that a particular job isn't as resource intensive as we initially expected. Pretty much, we give you more than enough data to really fine tune your environment on CircleCI. And we can talk about tests as well. We have a testing tab that allows us to analyze our test cases. As a developer, it brings a number of important things to my attention that I need to know. For example, flaky tests. Right now, we have 0 detected. Fantastic. But there are 18 test failures, something I might want to keep an eye on. These are things that I can take action on to optimize my pipeline. It's also particularly useful for our platform teams and individuals who are not in a developer role, but who are still responsible for the performance of our CI/CD pipelines and resulting expenditure. Ultimately, the goal of Insights is to understand what we are doing as a development team, how we are performing, and how we're burning our credits. Ultimately, this tells us how we're trending in terms of success rate, throughput, which is how many times we're deploying in the day, our mean time to recovery, which is how quickly we're recovering from pipeline failures, and the duration of our pipelines. And those 4 key parameters are what we have discovered make elite performing DevOps team, the DORA metrics. And that is ultimately what we are trying to get our users to achieve. We also support something called dynamic configuration. Dynamic configuration allows us to tackle use cases which are built on monolith code bases or monorepos. It allows us to create patterns in our configuration files such that based on the input or based on the condition satisfied, allow different things to happen. As a result, we can add more flexibility to our pipelines, and it can let you generate your config at runtime so that different variables or parameters can lead to different configurations. Additionally, with path filtering, we can support large monorepos and only run pipelines on certain subsections instead of the whole thing, reducing time and increasing efficiency. All right. Now, last pillar here, guardrails. Essentially, the things you can put in place to ensure peace of mind while increasing your development velocity. Here, again, one of my favorite features, Orbs. I promise that I'll talk about them later. Orbs are open source shareable packages of reusable configuration elements, including jobs, commands, and executors. They can be used to reduce configuration complexity as well as ensure standardization across pipelines and even organizations. Like I mentioned before, we have an open orb registry with all types of orbs, from certified ones written and tested by us to open source orbs built by the community. So when we're talking speed of onboarding and implementation of best practices, the concept of code reusability is of utmost importance to us. We saw how we can share code in a single project, but how can we share best practices and reuse code across different projects at scale? So let's take a look at our orb registry, right? So this is publicly available for all to see at circlecci.com/developer/orbs. And right here, I'm going to look into this node orb here. So you can see all the documentation that makes up the orb, as well as its usage, examples, jobs, commands, all the different commands you can use. And then at the very bottom, you get all of its source code, right? So all public and all maintained on GitHub, right? You have access to over 1,000 publicly created orbs listed in our registry. But what if you need to integrate internal business logic into your reusable code? We also give the option to our customers to create their own private orbs to meet such use cases. And then only that particular customer can see and use these to create reusable configuration. And of course, an extra layer of security around the use of these private orbs can be provided via our config policies, right? So I'll talk more about those in a second as well, because those are definitely part of the guardrails. So hopping into VS Code here, I'm just going to show you really quickly. In this same configuration YAML, remember how I said we have this Maven orb defined up here? So we're going to scroll down and see exactly how we use it. You can see it's defined by name and version. And then we can scroll down here, this Java check style job, right? What it does is we have a checkout. And then what we're going to do is we're going to run this Maven with cache, right? So this is how we implement the orb here. It's the built-in command for Maven to install dependencies with caching. So because we've satisfied the parameters that the command requires, what we've done now is we've grabbed and verified dependencies in about 4 or 5 lines of code. If we were to write this logic freehand, it could probably be 10 to 15. And again, what this allows us to do with orbs is standardize processes to ensure logic is bundled up and performed in the very same manner across all of our workflows. So if you have a large organization, you can enforce the use of particular orbs so that you know that things are being executed the same way every time, which is super useful for efficiency and great for guardrails. So what do we see here in terms of the value that orbs bring? They reduce technical debt and they give the developer a toolbox of commands that are already built, which allows them to access different parts of the platform and perform different tasks. And like before, we can use our config policies, like I mentioned, to standardize further, such as ensuring certain orbs are present. So if you're creating a config from scratch, it's really recommended to lean on using orbs. It's a really good opportunity to standardize on best practices so that you can scale quickly and efficiently. Now, let's talk about secure credentials and secrets management. You know how important it is to make sure we're not exposing credentials, even to developers, right? We don't want static credentials. Ideally, we want to have a global credential policy in place. Now, for one-off, non-sensitive environment variables, we support saving those within your project settings here. So what I'm going to do is hop into, you can see this is a project. I can hop into project settings. I can go to environment variables, and you can go ahead and add environment variables this way, name and value, super easy. However, I cannot stress enough that you should not put secrets or credentials here. Something like an AWS region, which is public and very convenient to put here, would be perfect. But regardless of what you put here, these are going to be obfuscated in the UI. But again, remember, these are static. So if you have a policy and you want to have dynamic credentials, this is not the way to do it. Now, if you want to go a step up and instead at the organizational level have a group of variables or secrets that you can expose to a set collection of projects or set groups of people, we have what are called contexts, right? Which is these here. These you can see are in organization settings, right? And these are a collection of environment variables, and each one has a password and token. Now, these are always obfuscated from the time they are created to any time they show up in the logs or config files. So no need to worry about anybody seeing them, right? So let's hop into a context here, right? The benefit of context is now any project that needs to use a group of variables or secrets can just declare this context in the configuration file, like I showed you earlier in workflows, right? So you don't really need anything more than that. Once these are defined, you can see here, this is just a dummy one we've created, but you can add as many environment variables as you like here. But you can also see, right, control, right? So the benefit of context is now any project that needs to, access these first has to go through project restrictions. So we can set project restrictions and say, hey, anyone, so long as they belong to project X, Y, and Z in this organization, or anyone, so long as they are a part of, let's say, the solutions engineering team or a backend team, whatever it might be, can access these contexts. And so now you can share this across projects, limit the distribution, limit the repetition and duplication of credentials, and also have some level of control on top of it. So this is definitely one step forward. However, let's go even further with this. Most ideally, we're not depending on context at all, right? Most ideally, you have something like Vault in your environment. In our particular instance, if you remember, I mentioned we were using HashiCorp Vault. And integration is open through CircleCI's OIDC policy, right? OIDC capability. So the cool part is now with OIDC, you can look in our docs here, right? We can add additional claims. So we can look at things like, hey, what is the project? What is the VCS origin? Where is this coming from? What is the reference? What branch in that VCS is this coming from? What context are they trying to get access to? Are they trying to access the main production context with all the good secrets in it? Are they allowed to do that? Are they trying to do an SSH rerun job? And pretty much based on those claims and an OIDC integration with something like Vault, we can decide, do they get access to these dynamic secrets? If they do, fantastic, they'll get them. But if not, right, you can go, what it'll do is it'll fail the pipeline. And actually, let me just show you a quick example here. Let's hop into this one, right? So you can see here, I closed it. It's gonna, this particular job, right, needs access to some secrets. So it's going to install the Vault agent, right? Then it's going to load the credentials from Vault, right? It's pretty much going to pass it a token and be like, hey, this is this project, this is who's running it, these are the contexts that I need. Can you go ahead and give me the right, access? And then what'll happen is if it does have access, it'll go ahead and get it. But if not, the whole job will pretty much fail and be like, hey, you don't have access to these secrets. And it's a really good way to make sure that only the right people who have the authority to do certain things can do those things, right? So, the benefit is those dynamic secrets, right? So if we don't want to have static long-term credentials, we can use short-lived one-time credentials by generating OIDC tokens. And the cool thing is, if you set up a context, you get an OIDC token that you can use. So it's really easy to implement. So just to recap, we can have contexts, which are global variables that can be restricted by security groups or projects. We can further impose OIDC across the host providers, and we can restrict that by branches and projects. And we can layer that with config policies to secure credentials within our pipelines. So now your DevSecOps teams no longer need to get into the weeds of managing credentials across a vast number of repos, right? So we're coming up on time here, but let's finally get into config policies, right? I know I've been talking about them the whole time. So let's go back to that idea, right? The idea of a new developer deploying to production on day one. It sounds scary at first, right? But it really shouldn't be if you have the right governance gates and policies in place. The goal should be that organizational security and compliance standards must be adhered to and implemented on the releases that are pushed through your build system. So imagine a developer wants to make a commit and get access to a production cluster on a non-main branch. They have inputted the parameters into their configuration to use their production context and credentials in the hope that we can get the work that they're working on released into the production environment. But they have come across this error, and here's a good example right here, policy evaluation failed, right? Now, what does that mean? It means, and it's what we call a hard violation in CircleCI. A hard violation stops the pipeline dead in its tracks before it even begins, right? So if we take a moment to analyze this, we can see that the credentials used, right, it says here, are the production credentials for the production environment, right? But the branch is not main. So in accordance with our governance and policies, only production credentials can be used on a main branch. This gives our developer peace of mind that it is very difficult for them to break anything or have any negative impact on our live applications and platforms with the appropriate guardrails in place. And you can enforce anything in the configuration. For example, let's say you don't want any pipeline to run without having a sneak scan for analytics. Boom. You can go ahead and implement that as a policy, and that's easy to do as well. But what is a policy, right? And you can actually see an example here, but I'm actually going to hop into the UI and just go to policies here. They're in organization settings, right? And now you can see a list of all of the policies enforced by our organization. A policy is a set of rules which determines what we can and can't do in CircleCI, and these can be particularly granular. Policies can include hard violations, like the one I was showing you before, but we also have what are called soft violations, right? And pretty much what that does is it allows the pipeline to proceed, but the violation will still be logged. For example, let's say you're using an old version of an Orbs, right? It's been deprecated. You can go ahead and set that as a soft failure, but be like, hey, in 30 days, we're going to turn this to a hard failure. So update all of your, Python Orbs or something, right? So that's another way that, things can be enforced. So you can see this is an example of a policy here, and they're created using Rego, which is a very popular query language and built on Open Policy Agent. Config as code, like we always love to do. And these tools are typically handled by DevOps, platform, or DevSecOps teams. So there shouldn't be a learning curve. It should be pretty easy to hit the ground running, which is really nice here. We also have some config helpers in case you aren't quite familiar with Rego, but you want to get started quickly. We have a whole bunch of helper policies. So it's a really good starting point. We have a couple use cases covered here, such as enforcing the size and type of a based image that's used in a job, right? So let's say you don't want people to use more than a Docker large because they're expensive. You can go ahead and say like, hey, anything larger than that, fail the build, right? And so it's a good way just to maintain certain organizational policies across your entire organization, right? And you need admin access to change them, obviously. So I hope all of that makes sense. So kind of going back to the original example of a new developer who wants to make an impression on day one, this helps if they do things the right way without incurring unnecessary risk based on what your company mandates. So what did we see, right? We saw our developer trying to commit to our production environment, and we saw that they were not allowed to do so because they were using credentials or configuration which did not conform with configuration policies that were in place. This allows the organization to ensure governance and standardization while also reducing risk. It also gives the developers peace of mind that they won't break anything when they release code. As such, they can produce their best work with a sense of freedom and autonomy. So that we went through today was the speed, the efficiency, and the guardrails to make your whole CI/CD process efficient while making sure that things don't break, right? Move fast and break things is dead. At this point, we can move fast and still make sure things don't get broken. So with all of that said, we're up at time. We got about 5 minutes left. So at this point, I would like to pause for some Q&A. We have a little bit of time left, so please use the Q&A box functionality. And while you're doing that, I'm going to figure out how I can open that screen here for me. But appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and answer some questions if they come through. And of course, for further project examples, you can check out CircleCI.com. You can sign up for free, which is really nice, and get building straight away on our free plan. Our documentation has loads of examples of pipeline configurations that you can just drag and drop or copy and paste into your repositories and get to building today. So I personally love it. We have a lot of customer testimonials and use cases, which I hope you check out, along with Orbs and documentation. All of it is publicly available for you to use as well. So thank you. All right, for Q&A. Let me see. Can we have a policy require a particularly named workflow or job? Yes. So the nice part is, again, if it is something that can be put into your configuration file, you can use Rego to enforce it. So it's, Rego isn't something that's built by us. It's an open policy agent, and it can be used to enforce things in, YAML-based configuration files. So yes, Andrew, that is absolutely possible. There's another question here about storing build artifacts. You can store build artifacts wherever you like. You can store them on CircleCI, or if you have like an artifactory or somewhere where you store your build artifacts, you can go ahead and make that connection to it and store that as well. Mastan, I have it said command are mandatory after workflow. If this is in the configuration file, no. The configuration commands are not mandatory. You can use them, but they are not mandatory to be put after workflows. You can I think you can put them at the top or wherever you want, or not use them at all. And then a quick comparison to Azure DevOps, Octopus, and Jenkins. I think this came from a anonymous attendee here. In terms of features and functionality, I think if you've been using Jenkins, if you've used Jenkins in the past, you know that one of the biggest things is the maintenance, right? Having to maintain things yourself. It's the benefit of a SaaS solution is you don't have to worry about updating plugins. You don't have to worry about whether it crashes or something isn't working right. That is not the responsibility of your teams. With CircleCI, that's all managed. Now we also have a server option, which I didn't really get into that much, but we also have, if you have self-hosted requirement options and you can't use a SaaS option, we also have a server environment or a server install that you can install on your own on-prem. It's a pretty quick and easy Helm install, runs in Kubernetes, and is also really easy to use, and maintains most of the feature priority. There are a couple of things obviously that we can't do both on-prem and in the cloud, but most of it can be done, which is nice. Azure DevOps, you mentioned in Octopus, it's just feature parity, or it's just features that we offer. So, things like parallelism, right? Or things like SSH rerunning, right? Or even things like configuration policy management, right? These are all things that I think we only support right now. And they're all, I think, very important tools for doing what you want to do in the field of DevOps. And I think that is all of the questions that I have seen here. We have, and actually we are at time. So it looks like I have timed that perfectly. So folks, if there are no more questions, I want to thank you all so much for your time. And we're going to go ahead and conclude. So thank you very much for joining. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you all here. And of course, if you want to find out more about CircleCI, please do not hesitate to contact us. So thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.